Welcome to the Exponential Minds Podcast. The research, development, launch, and growth of new technologies is creating incredible momentum in the modern world. Join futurist Nikolas Badminton as he talks with the innovators and the exponential minds that are tackling some of the biggest problems and creating solutions that are propelling humanity to the next level.
Hello, my name is Nikolas Badminton and welcome to the Exponential Minds Podcast. I travel the world speaking to people about where the future could go. And today I'm incredibly excited to speak to a futurist Foresight practitioner and designer, Monika Bielskyte. She's a futurist with an artist's eye and an inventor's mind. She consults on prototypes, culturally diverse, socially and environmentally engaged future world designs for media industry, technology companies and government. She's also an expert in the immersive media space and edutainment, and her work consists in connecting bleeding-edge technological innovation with some of the world's most original creative visions that explores the relationships between speculative science fiction narratives and the unfolding of global futures. Welcome, Monika, and thanks for joining us from South Africa.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk with you in these crazy times.
Definitely crazy times. I've been following you for quite some time online and looking at your talks, and I'm incredibly excited to speak to you today. And I think, I'd love to know how you sort of become who you are today, really influential, activistic, digital nomad, as it were, and where you started and your journey to your current state.
It was definitely not a straight line, but a rather windy path. So I was born in what was Soviet Union at that time, currently Lithuania. And I had this incredible opportunity to come of age at a time where simultaneously I experienced the collapse of the physical walls and a totalitarian state, as well as sort of the opening up of the digital world. And I think these two simultaneous experiences have been quite fundamental in shaping who I am and how I think. I guess quite a critical eye that I have on the world. Because with the collapse of the totalitarian state, it was not just sort of the infrastructure that collapsed. It was an entire propaganda/belief system. From that very limited enclosure, a very limited access that I had as a kid, all of a sudden, it's like all these tendrils into the vast open world became available to me through the first means of digital communication and first sort of social media platforms. So I think that was quite instrumental. I was a bit of a rebel, so I stopped going to school at a fairly young age, 16 to be precise. Still graduated my exams, but had a lot of sort of political interests and political inquiries, at the same time creative practice, which took me as a photographer to not exactly war zones, but pretty much post-disaster, post-war zones. Found myself in a lot of very, very tricky situations, nearly losing my life, getting caught with bombings and crossing minefields and having a gunpoint at my throat in remote areas, predominantly in Asia at that time, which, I think all of these experiences were quite fundamental for me in perceiving reality, outside just that usual techno-fetishistic, techno-optimistic type of a discourse that I think is quite popular in among a lot of other Foresight practitioners. And the creative practice slowly kind of became a creative agency / magazine project, initially very much involved with sort of arts and design and these conventionally artistic disciplines, but slowly or fast, depending on how you perceive it, shifted towards more collaborations with scientific institutions and technological organizations. And as I departed the company that I started in my early 20s, by my mid 20s, after a nearly fatal accident. I really was asking myself, what is it I can do that could allow me to fully connect the many obsessions and pathological curiosities and desire to understand what is happening and how did we get here and where are we going. And I guess that just molded into Foresight practice. It grew out of the creative practice, though. Initially, what I started with is because my work as a creative director has always been very, futuristic in its outward appeal, I guess. So I ended up in Hollywood consulting and working on different science fiction productions and consulting different production houses on the work that we're doing with tech companies and any kind of futuristic or future related advertising that we're doing. So it's kind of like helping to shape some of these big names, big directors, producers, writers, how they depict the future. At that time, these were sort of very early days of VR. Oculus was just being sold to Facebook. And so I got to get quite involved with these sort of very early stages of immersive media and had a lot of questions and critique about how things were being done. And the next thing I knew, I started speaking about it. very, 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 quite in a quite edgy manner.
Yeah.
And people were telling me like, Monika, you should be more optimistic about it. We should high five each other more. And I was like, no, we actually have to be really critical, because if we aren't going to be critical of what we do, the market will be. And it's important that we really think of all the worst case scenarios, that we really think, do we really need to do this? What do we actually really need to do? And so anyway, that's what got me into the speaking circuit. It was kind of speaking about the future of content and how the future of immersive media technology is the future of computation, and what is the future of user interface and user experience, which I really try to bend towards it being, the future of human experience and human interface. And as I guess the immersive media technology was moving a little bit slowly, I kind of moved back into this larger picture of the future and what future is really about, and how we tell the stories of it, and how we tell the stories of it in a meaningful way, instead of just, stereotyping and promulgating more despairs of dystopia and these very disempowering visions of predominantly very depressing things that humanity tends to lean towards. I guess all these dots and everything connected, and since last few years I've been trying to marry in my work sort of very much on the ground deep research. I've worked and traveled and researched in 90 countries and counting. My focus is very much global south, so I spend a lot of time outside of the places that most other futurists focus on. Really, being on the ground, trying to understand, where is the emergence and what is about, and how, what other people define as the black swan events or black swan apparitions. For me, I see that as some kind of pioneering movements of people or ideas, for better or worse, and how instead of looking at these things as some kind of like, freak or sort of minor strange things, extrapolate and like, well, how these could actually become global movements, or how these could become global innovations, how could it affect the world on a very global scale, and obviously combine that with a lot of reading and talking with experts in the technology space and academic institutions, etc. So research is really the foundation of all of it. The next thing is very much giving talks and consulting media companies, tech companies, and more recently also cities, countries, governments. And then the final, and I guess the fun part, and the part for which a lot of people know me and my work, is very much that sci-fi world design. So both working on science fiction projects, but also just kind of talking about it, tweeting about it, speaking on, where dystopias and utopias fail, and why do we need this new framework of protopia? What does that involve? And kind of the aesthetics of it, the conceptual framework of it, the spiritual framework of it. So I guess that's a long story of how did I get here and where I'm at right now, and hopefully also a little bit of where I'm going.
It's incredibly interesting to me. I mean, this is you living your entire life on the edge from a very young age, and getting through all of these different experiences and pushing yourself to go to the places that other people aren't going to, and building that body of work, which is memory and experience and connection into other cultures. I mean, you're in Africa right now, and obviously the African diaspora and lots of sort of ancient cultures as well. From what I can see of what you've been sharing over the years is a real deep interest in the ancient cultures. And now we're sort of caught in this web of a global pandemic where, you know, that's a hidden enemy, but the visual enemies, the things that we do see that are prominent, the things that we have to challenge, are more real and visceral than we've ever seen before. But ultimately, they're rooted in ancient cultural practices in human society, right?
Yeah, 100%. I don't view a lot of what the Western world defines as sort of ancient cultures in a way. It's kind of these words such as, you know, primitive, aboriginal. In a way, they're quite problematic because they relegate the worldviews and in people that represent those worldviews that are sort of its living manifestations into something that is somewhat of the past, whereas it does exist no matter of sort of the settler patriarchal erasure of it. They're still very much alive and present. It's just that unfortunately our culture, sort of the dominating culture of the world, is quite blind to it. You know, it's like this saying that there's no such thing as the voiceless, or giving voice. There are only those that are being deliberately unheard. And for me, I guess my research practice is very much about stepping out of convenient points of views and convenient truths, and looking as much as I can into just into the world in all of its many manifestations. And maybe that's why also I have this issue with the word diversity, because in a way, diverse, you know, oh, this is a diverse candidate, oh, this is a very diverse group. It implies that somebody else is default, and then, well, who is default? Who made you decide that you are default? So I prefer the word plurality. You know, within that very word, we're finding that plural. It's not something, you know, one and then, well, all these marginal voices or marginal things. It implies that there's multiplicity of voices and multiplicity of points of views, and if you're not integrating those views, then you are actually impoverishing whoever that you're addressing to. You know, if you're a conference and you organize in such a way that it doesn't embed plurality within it, you impoverish your audience. You know, if you are writing a book and you do not integrate, again, these multiplicity of points of views, then, you know, again, you know, your reader is going to get a very incomplete vision of what the world is about. You know, and for me, that does involve also looking into a whole lot of quite unpleasant places too. It's not just about, you know, beautiful and very inspiring stuff that a lot of people that look up my Instagram, they think that I'm like, oh my God, you're living a life. You know, you're going to all these gorgeous places and all that stuff, you know, the depths of Sahara Desert and then the Amazon forest and whatever. But, you know, I also go to the sort of the rabbit holes of sort of right-wing Twitter accounts and Reddit threads and all that stuff. And for me, it's very important to understand also these very dark and shadowy places. Yeah, it's very important to see all of the aspects of it to be able to shape my thoughts on, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good segue when we're talking about disappearing into the rabbit holes of information, disinformation, contrasting points of view. the infodemic behind the pandemic as well. I mean, the idea of plurality is something, you know, I've spoken about when I've gone and spoken about natural resources in Canada, you know, the First Nations, the importance of that, and the balance of communities and whatever, and it's incredibly important. But when we're finding ourselves in this world where we're being told to, you know, sit tight and not communicate, not communicate in person with other people, and to lock down, and suddenly these whirlpools of information start forming. And I know that we spoke about this, and we should really get into talking about COVID-19 and the state of the world, framing what we're going to talk about here. But like, how do we get out of where we are today? You know, thinking about foresight, you know, giving guidance not only to governments and the communities around us, but into the entertainment and edutainment industry, so we can really build a foundation of good information that's going to be culturally relevant and will help culturally fortify the world.
Well, these are a lot of questions, right? And let's get into sort of them one by one. But maybe to start with, I want to share a science writer that I really profoundly appreciate his reporting during this pandemic. And if there's one science writer to read, predominantly, though, you know, disclaimers, predominantly for what's happening in the Western world, as well as sort of overall medical understanding of the disease. You know, in that way, he covers it globally, but in terms of its impact, you know, he covers it predominantly for America and the Western world. It's Ed Yong. He also wrote this brilliant book, I Contain Multitudes, about how our microbiome and all these different microorganisms living within our bodies really are part of us. You know, one of his articles, Why is Pandemic So Confusing? I think something like that was the title of it. It's on The Atlantic. And the ending of that article kind of really dug into a lot of what's happening today. And what it spoke of is that the reasons why this pandemic is happening are very complex. And the way it's affecting different populations, different groups of people are also quite complex. So it's not, you know, it's not black or white. There's a lot of shades of gray, and there's a lot of texture to what is unfolding. But most importantly, that complexity involves also challenging our very own worldview and our own actions. It doesn't allow to externalize and just say, well, it's the blame of this one particular thing, one particular person, or one particular technology, or one particular conspiracy, or something like that, right? And what we've been seeing a lot, you know, the current pandemic is very much happening because of our exploitation of relationship to the natural world over which we do not preside, but rather are part of, right? But we've been acting like we preside upon it, which again, in this case, implies our very core foundational belief systems, right? Our religions and stuff like that. So in this very exploitational way of treating natural environment and encroaching on the natural habitat in a way that wildlife, you know, needs to flee and comes closer and closer to human habitat, and that's what allows for a lot of these diseases to transmit. You know, but that combined then with sort of obviously our global networks and how fast the pathogen can move around the world, and then of course our weakened immunity because of profoundly unhealthy lifestyles, you know, processed foods, lack of exercise, stress, lack of sort of feeling of fulfillment and community, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, these are multiple reasons. And in a way, how what we see happening in the United States of America, of populations of color, immigrant populations, diasporic populations being affected disproportionately, right, by what is happening, you know, that's also, you know, due to sort of institutionalized racism, institutionalized injustice, and all of those profound inequities that exist within our society, which again will always imply at whichever tier of privilege you sit in, that you are part of what is happening, right? You need to change as well. You can't just point and say, oh, they are to blame. And that's why we have these crazy conspiracy theories spreading on, Bill Gates is the most evil man on earth and he's trying to implant us all with whatever. And conveniently, when all these, mass surveillance conspiracy theories spread, they all focus on somebody like Bill Gates, but never mention somebody like Peter Thiel in the same sentence. And you're like, wow, that's quite a glaring omission. Clearly, you don't even understand what surveillance is about, right? You haven't been following neither what Cambridge Analytica has been doing, nor Palantir, et cetera, et cetera. Then, I can't even enter the whole like 5G conversation, which is like, well, basic physics, right? And basic biology. Like you can't, if somebody tells you that they figured out this way, that the disease spreads and they don't even understand the biology, the basic biology of what virus is, like, well, you can't discount that opinion already, right? But what it does, it actually points to fail of education. It points to the failure of our culture at large, which is delivered through education, but also through entertainment, where things are always explained through this one big evil, a guy or a woman or a thing. And once we solve that, everything else is solved, rather than speaking about, well, maybe it's the system itself and all of us who partake in that system.
We're fetishizing, the companies that are the over 100 companies trying to develop a vaccine, and that it's within months, and that suddenly it's coming out as faster than ever. Operation Warp Speed, as the US administration is calling it as well. But like this acceleration of conspiracy, the weakened immunity, all of this to me seems like a failure of the industrialized complex that we've created, the way that we travel, the way that we communicate, the way that cities are built, the way that communities are sort of put into boxes, right?
Absolutely. And again, these are all political, social, biological, cultural, physical, reasons and consequences and implications, right? So it is this complex web, complex interweaving of causes and consequences, that unfortunately, neither our popular culture nor our education system does not prepare us to reckon with, right? And then I think another major thing that what really has been troubling me a lot during this pandemic is seeing some truly phenomenal work being done by researchers and journalists, predominantly of color, significantly women of color, that are covering sort of the inequities and injustices that are unfolding real time, right? However, very little of that critical inquiry, very little of these views actually end up in any of the Foresight decks, in any of the post-COVID conversations, right? So there's amazing work being done in sort of analyzing what's wrong in the present moment. However, very few of these understandings of those considerations somehow end up in that whole, world post-COVID, or how do we tackle COVID type of conversations, especially in the sort of higher levels of corporate and political, I don't know what you call it, just access, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I think the root cause of this global pandemic right now is pretty much Western exceptionalism. And I found it very funny when I think it was Xinhua TV, basically China's national state TV produces a propaganda video, animated little video of them saying to America, hey, we got this thing, COVID-19, it's pretty serious, it affects people a lot, da 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 da, and then basically America just kind of waving it away. And I think the Western exceptionalism and how it played the role in it becoming truly a global pandemic cannot be underestimated. So even if China has not done it all right, it could have been more transparent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we know that. I mean, you can't also be like, I mean, it's a totalitarian state, right? Like you can't expect it to have done everything that a democracy would have done. However, they gave enough warnings for the Western world to heed it. And Europe initially was, oh, well, this really crazy stuff is happening in China, but surely it couldn't happen to us. And then all of a sudden it was happening. It was happening in Italy, was happening in Spain, and there were all these gruesome reports of triage being done in hospitals and stuff like that. And yet America was still sort of this profound American exceptionalism was saying to them, no, but it could not happen here. And the next thing you know, wow, it is happening in New York. And then next thing you know, oh, okay, it's actually affecting disproportionately Black and brown populations. Oh, well, okay, so then even if some of us die, more of them die. So it's not that serious, right? And I think that's severely under-discussed part. Similarly, so now I'll just speak a little bit from African perspective. What happened here on the African continent? What happened, especially here in South Africa? Actually, it wasn't imported by the Chinese. The first COVID-19 cases, majority of the first COVID-19 cases on the African continent were imported either by predominantly wealthy, in South Africa, predominantly white people that went on their sort of skiing holiday or something like that in Italy, or international tourists. Right. So, so we knew what was happening in China. People started understanding what was happening in Europe, and they still didn't pay enough attention or didn't take the responsibility and brought the disease here on the continent, knowing that it is much the existing infrastructure, the financial means of a country's, do not allow the same type of action to tackle a pandemic explosion here. However, and now surprise, surprise, African governments at large have actually been tackling this pandemic much better than majority of the Western governments. Now I'm generalizing, right? Like even my own country of birth, Lithuania, has tackled the pandemic really quite well, or the Czech Republic, etc. But let's say if we compare it to Western Europe and especially America, African governments have tackled it much better. The lockdowns happened before, in many cases, even the first death. The hand sanitizers, wipes, and stuff like that have been provided by the government to all the shops and malls and any kind of social places. Social gatherings were banned. People living in the townships have been delivered water tanks to increase sanitary conditions. Homeless people have been provided shelters. And this is happening on the African continent, where it is not happening in United States of America, the greatest nation on earth, the wealthiest nation on earth, etc. Right now, Senegal has developed. I think I'm afraid to make a mistake, but I believe it's a something like $1 under 1 hour test. They developed a $60 ventilator. But are we hearing any of these news? Is African leadership being sort of elevated by international media, or how well they've been tackling this crisis? No, we're not hearing any of that. The news that we're hearing is, oh, there are locust swarms in East Africa. So imagine the locust swarms and the famine they could generate plus the coronavirus. Well, that's going to be really bad. Soon enough, we're going to have those terrible stories to report from the African continent. Right? But we're not hearing no positive stories. And it's that much more shocking because, personally, so one of the things that I created to way before this pandemic, It's just a means to, it's called knowledge exchange group.
Right.
That's our little group on WhatsApp with friends, creatives, innovators, activists, scientists, researchers, more or less around the globe. We're about 100. And I specifically try to curate different people from different disciplines and different cultures and based in different places. And everybody's, the rule is no disinformation, no conspiracies. Please, verify your sources and let's exchange meaningful knowledge in whatever that is, right? News articles or books or films or critical opinions, etc. And this group has been really quite instrumental as the pandemic started to unfold for us, by people stationed in different parts of the world, from India to Mexico to Brazil to South Africa, Tunisia, America, UK, so on and so forth, right? In kind of updating each other on what is actually happening on the ground. And whenever we're hearing some kind of, oh, these are the crazy news coming from Brazil, can you confirm, is this true? Is this really the reality on the ground? And so it's actually been shocking to have these updates from people in different regions. Most recently, a friend of ours was reporting from how Tunisia has been tackling this crisis. And it's been doing that spectacularly. And yet I have not seen one major international news reports on how Tunisia has been tackling this crisis so much better than not just, America or UK, but also better than Sweden, better than Belgium, better than Netherlands, right? And
Yeah.
so I feel we find ourselves a lot of these stories that could be inspiring us, that could change our point of view on the world, are just not being rendered visible to us. And of course, it's very acute during this pandemic. But I just want to say, that's what happens also in popular sort of science fiction storytelling. And you see all these movies where whenever action is happening in the global south, well, they're just going to put this yellow filter and make everything look real shabby, right? So there's this desire to skew reality to what is convenient to the dominating ideology. And of course, that does not allow us to see the world neither for what it is nor for what it can be.
How do we sort of take something like the knowledge exchange group and sort of bridge that gap? How do we increase the visibility to the stories? How do we engage, the very large news agencies from Al Jazeera all the way across to agencies like CNN and crowdsourced news groups and, the people that are really trying to do, very positive but very open-minded and far-reaching journalism? Do we keep that group pure and then have bulletins that come out of that? Or do we bring people in, even if they're just as observers?
Yeah, well, the group is actually, we've been having these conversations with a friend of mine who was one of the sort of initial people that we were having just this tea/drinks, four of us, and we're like, oh, let's just create this WhatsApp group where we can share with each other the books that we're reading,
Right.
the reading references. And he was like, wow, Monika, this has become this amazing thing, this amazing group that is really helping us to parse. Because a lot of the times we'll also read something, we'll read a book and we're like, who in the group has critical opinion over it? Who has sort of an article to read that maybe takes on this particular writer or really kind of, like help us to think critically about stuff. But in a way that we're not shouting over each other, we're really supporting each other. But I think that is only possible because the group has been highly curated to include people that are informed, that are kind, that are curious, that are open, etc., etc. But indeed, we've been thinking, okay, how could this scale? How could we sort of open it to the world? And I have not found the answer yet. But right now, for us, this group works because, again, we're able to ask each other fairly open questions. Whereas if you'd ask something like that on Twitter, all of a sudden you could get attacked, and people would be like, "Oh my God, you're so ignorant," or how can you not know this?" And the truth is that a lot of us do not know a lot of things, right? Because in a group there might be somebody who's like a top researcher in um, sort of biomimicry, sort of fungi technological systems. And then there's somebody who's an activist for indigenous rights or something like that, right? So naturally, everybody will have sort of slightly complementary knowledge. But I'm indeed thinking of how this could be opened up to be a bigger platform. And especially, I think a very huge thing for myself has always been, and that's why I go very much into the field, and that's why sometimes my life gets a little hectic, and I had some close encounters with the other side meaning death. Um, because I get into the field, I don't stay in just my ivory tower, and it makes it that much more shocking. Instances such as last week I was listening to a podcast or interview, a YouTube interview between somebody that is considered to be a very very prominent futurist, Foresight practitioner, and a very kind, lovely person. That I had the chance to briefly encounter in my life. And yet, when I was listening to the conversation between him and an interviewer who also is an important figure in this whole kind of like future space, I was shook to realize how they were exchanging things such as, well, majority, like not majority, all of us are working from home these days. And I'm like, all of us who? All of us where? Like,
Right.
fact are, majority of the world's population is unable to work from home. These are the privilege of upper middle class. Like, majority of the world's population are unable to work from home. Then they were speaking about, like, we have these issues with the bandwidth, because everybody's streaming videos, so the bandwidth gets slower, etc. And I'm like, majority of the world's population doesn't have Wi-Fi in their homes. Then they went into, and sometimes we don't have enough of the devices, so we have to share some of the devices, have some kind of schedule. And I'm like, majority of the world's population doesn't have the devices that you speak about, right? And so in these moments, you absolutely see these blind spots of a lot of people in our industry in how they don't actually realize what the world is about.
Yeah.
And I had a very, and this is maybe like a bit of a rough story to tell, but I had something quite extreme happen to me just a few days ago. Me and my friend went on a hike, and we went on a hike on a slightly off side of a mountain, and we ended up being followed by somebody. And then there was an altercation in the encounter. The person pulled out 2 knives, and essentially we could have very much been dead by now. And the purpose wasn't even robbery. It was somebody who clearly had some mental health issues, maybe drug issues. It was a very, very violent encounter that put a lot of the statistic of, violent deaths, especially violent women's deaths, to a very, it made it very personal, it made it very direct, it made it into a essentially first-person experience. And I think, but luckily we were able to escape by chance, because the person thought I had pepper spray, and there was like a blink of a moment when he was a little agitated, and then we just ran for our lives. And this is the first time something like that happened to me, actually, on the continent. I've been very, very safe, and I've spent a lot of time here, and I've been sort of harassed and attacked much more in the United States of America. but this was something else. This was very, very, very violent. Um, and
Yeah.
what it really made me think is how many of the science sort of directors in the Hollywood industry at large, but especially sort of directors, because I refer a lot to science fiction films, um, who direct these movies and who idolize that sort of violence, that sort of end of the world dystopia. Everybody's just being mean and cruel and just terrible to each other and try to kill each other. How many of these people actually have experienced any of that in first person? And the answer is very few. Very few of these people who idolize end of the world have ever experienced end of the world.
Right.
Whereas a lot of peoples in the global south have experienced end of the world. People in South Africa with apartheid have experienced a full-blown dystopia, right? And that's why it makes this dystopia and end of the world and everybody, man eats man kind of visions. It makes it less exciting, right? Um, and that's why we shouldn't be fetishizing that. That's maybe why we should be creating alternative visions of the future. So I mean, this kind of crazy incident that just happened really made me think of that in a very personal manner. Because it's not the first time when something like this happened, though this was exceptionally violent. And I'm so glad to be alive.
Mm.
And I'm so glad also to be reminded of this understanding that a lot of people that fetishize these sort of end of the world scenarios have never experienced any significant end of the world in their lives. And then on the flip side, also a lot of the people that just sell utopias and exponential technology is going to save everything, and blockchain or AI or VR is this magic pill that all of a sudden is going to change everything, also have not experienced reality. They've only experienced that kind of privileged, um, very upper middle class global north perspective. And both of these options, neither so that unrealistic utopian thinking nor utterly depressing dystopian vision is helpful in these times
Yeah.
that we're living.
Yeah, and and for me, this seems overall, it's a lack of compassion, empathy, creativity, experience, and even going out to find the experiences. I completely, I connect with you, and I've been so mad at so many people. This is the great pause, and this is the great reckoning, and this is this. I've fallen myself into these traps as well. And TV, radio interviews, they just want to talk about disrupted transportation and whatever. And I've just worked with a couple of clients where it's behind the scenes conversations are getting super real, especially when you're running global organizations. And this comes down to equity and recognition of cultures within continents, and not coming in and suddenly trying to whitewash, greenwash, whatever you want to call it, those cultures with a brand hierarchy and a brand playbook that suddenly it works in the US, it works in South America, but maybe it doesn't work in Asia, maybe it doesn't work in the African continent as well. But that's okay, because they can fall into line, right?
Yeah, actually, I'm just reading this amazing book called The Sand Talk, and just as I was having lunch, this is the passage that was spoken. And if I may quote it, I think it's quite related to what you're saying. And so the passage reads, "The most remarkable thing about Western civilization is its ability to absorb any object or idea, alter it, sanitize it, rebrand it, and market it. Even ideas that are a threat can be co-opted and put to work. The Romans did it with Christianity, an ideology of the poor and enslaved that threatened the foundations of the empire. When torture and murder became ineffective as deterrents, they simply embraced the idea and made it state religion, rewriting the holy text to suit their needs and rebranding it as a new system of control. In the same way, In the same way that plants can be tweaked at the genetic level to become the intellectual property of one company and then replace all similar crops in a region, ideas can be re-engineered to serve the interests of the powerful. It's not a conspiracy, it's just power doing what power does, right? And I think, I mean, this passage it just summed up so much of what is being happening, and I call it, sort of the design for industry. And
Right.
and for me, if you start with the notion that you're designing for rather than designing with, if you're coming from the outside, you're looking at things from a sort of ivory tower, bird's eye view, you don't even understand what is the soil on which you're standing, who lives in that soil, what are all of these entangled ecosystems, you will never do the right thing. Never, ever. Unless you're designing with, in a truly equitable, collaborative way, you you always end up with an exploitational system, right? And also this notion of what he speaks, what the writer, the brilliant writer Tyson Yunkaporta, what he speaks about is that the importance of understanding different idea systems behind power. And I think that's where our education has failed, and our education is failing today. From the education of history, where we essentially being taught history as a series of events that succeed each other rather than a series of ideas that are being birthed and then modified and then sometimes completely turned around and misused and co-opted, and how those ideas truly have consequences to actually the ideas behind a lot of sort of scientific and technological talk of today.
Mm.
And in a really funny instance, and let's mark it sort of as this moment in time, I found it there was a fascinating exchange between Ivanka Trump, Elon Musk, and Lily Wachowski the other day. And Elon Musk tweeted, "Take the red pill," which is very much sort of a dog whistle to the, I guess, to sort of to the right wing. The very notion of sort of like getting red pilled and stuff like that, of a lot of conspiracy theories and all these, Reddit corners of the internet. And then Ivanka responded to it, "Taken." And then Lily Wachowski said, "Fuck both of you." Lily Wachowski is obviously a co-creator of the Matrix. And Matrix was co-created by two trans women, and the red pill actually in a way was a reference to the estrogen pill,
Right.
right? So it is so fascinating, right, to see how a particular idea that was sort of developed in a project by these two trans women has been completely co-opted by a political party that missed its meaning entirely. But at some point, the creator just had enough and said, okay, well, this is not what this was about. And kind of then the shock that happens to the system when people that sort of been living on a particular ideology, has its own creator say, actually, you completely misunderstood it. Most of the time, people just keep putting the blinders on and say, well, actually, I'll pretend that I have never heard it. Or like, well, why would you put then these ideas out in the marketplace if you're not willing for us to twist and turn and just make them into whatever it is? But these are very important conversations to be had, and especially when it comes to future, especially when it comes to any of that technological futurist talk, it's important to understand what and who these ideas serve, and what and who these ideas and these tools and these platforms not will only underserve, but will further marginalize,
Right.
right? And unless we're having that conversation, we're not really having a conversation about the future.
Yeah, and absolutely. And Lily Wachowski didn't actually, feel any need to describe what she was feeling or whatever. It was raw, it was visceral, it was very directional, and it was complete in its brevity, right? I feel that this is incredibly valuable conversation, and this feels like the beginning of many conversations that we can have, Monika. So I'm aware of the time that we have and whatever. Can you just share with the audience, where they can connect with you, see your thinking and your writing, and try and direct them a little bit towards sort of those communities that you participate with?
100%. So I'm just under my name at Monika Bielskyte, MONIKABIELSKYTE on most of the social media channels.
Right.
So I guess Twitter, I retweet a lot of people and work from my community. So if you are looking to follow thinkers, writers, activists that are coming from these multiple perspectives, tuning into my Twitter is a good place. My Instagram is really a lot of my travel and journeys and my life, but hopefully some inspiring moments as well for now when we all kind of locked in at home, because I try to, as I travel the world, I try to tell the stories both of sort of the present, the past, and the future. And a lot of my talks can be found on YouTube and Vimeo. So just look up my name and look up whatever's most recent. And the newest project I just started a couple of weeks ago, or what it seems like a couple of weeks. Time is liquid, time is elastic. Is at Protopia Futures. So Protopia singular, Futures plural, on Instagram, and that's where I'm sharing just some images that inspire me, that have been inspiring, that triggered ideas in my head with a commentary and sort of daily, I guess, thoughts and inspirations and reading on the Instagram stories.
Thank you so much, Monika Bielskyte. I've been following you online for quite some time. I find it incredibly useful to go down into the rabbit holes that you present to me on certainly on Twitter. So I'm going to leave a link not only to your Twitter and Instagram handles as part of this podcast. I'm going to link to everything from like the $1 COVID-19 test in Senegal, Sand Talk link, all the way through to Ed Yong's Why is the Pandemic so confusing. But Monika Bielskyte, thank you very much. You stay safe down there in South Africa and keep pushing the boundaries of thinking.
Thank you so much. I feel so lucky to be weathering the storm in such a beautiful place that I'm in.